Good morning. Good morning. We begin today's daf. Today's daf is daf Chaf Zayin 27 in Bava Basra. We begin by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank our TALMUD Torah sponsor for the month of Tammuz, Daniel and Batsheva Pava of Hashmonaim in Israel, who are sponsoring all the shurim and all the drushes of this month in commemoration of their father, Reb Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh Vegh of Philadelphia on his first Yahrzeit. Reb Shlomo was a child survivor of Aushwitz and a muvhak of Reb Michel Ber Weismendel. He was Zeichet to leave over 90 descendants who are yireh Shamaim. May his neshama have an aliya. We also thank the sponsor of the Day of Learning, Stanley and Cynthia Ringo, commemoration of the Yahrzeit of Yitzchak, Isaac, ben Yeshaya, Moshe, father of Cynthia Ringo. The neshama should have an aliya, and the family should have a neshama. We're going to pick up on daf Vav on the base, approximately 10-15 lines from the bottom, Amar Ula. So I handed out these sheets this morning. It's not really so difficult, but some people really appreciate more of a visual learning experience. And as I go through all those numbers or the math calculations, seeing it in front of you might be a little bit more helpful. So yesterday we ended off discussing the halacha of Ula, which is that, or not necessarily Ula, but the halacha that when a person plants a tree, the roots are going to extend 16 amos out. And those first 16 amos, as we described yesterday, as Rashi told us, those first 16 amos are essential for the tree's growth, and it's going to suck the nourishment from that land. So therefore, that's considered damage. If you're going to allow your roots from your tree to enter your next door neighbor's backyard, for the first 16 amos, you are essentially using the nourishment of land that does not belong to you. And therefore, our Gemara starts with the words Amar Ula. Ula teaches us, Ilon hasamach l'meitzar v'soch sheish esrei ama. You have a tree which is so close to the border of your friend's field. How close is it? It's within 16 amos. The halacha is gazlanhu. The owner of that tree is a thief. And therefore, in other words, he is sustaining his tree by the use of his friend's field. Therefore, ve'ein mevi'in mimenu bikurim. You're not allowed to bring bikurim from the fruits that grow on the tree. Why? Because when a person brings bikurim, he needs to say the words, Asher tavi mi'aretzecha, was going to be brought from your land. And you can't say mi'aretzecha because it's not your land. Your tree is actually being sustained. Those fruits that you're bringing are being sustained by your next door neighbor's field. And therefore, it would be a lie to say Asher tavi mi'aretzecha was brought from your field. And therefore, you're considered a gazlan, and you're not allowed to bring those fruits as bikurim. You're a thief. Those fruits are not entitled to be brought as bikurim. Now the Gemara asks a question. Minale l'ulaha. Where does Ula know that a person's tree will extend the roots 16 amos in either direction, and it's going to be sustained by those roots to the extent of 16 amos? In other words, how does he get this number of 16 amos? Let's just give a very brief introduction to the Mishnayos that we're going to bring in now. You don't need the papers yet for this introduction. The following two Mishnayos that we're going to bring in are discussing a halacha called Tosefes Shavias. We know Shavias, otherwise known as Shemitah, refers to the 7th year in Eretz Yisrael, the sabbatical year in Eretz Yisrael, where no work may be performed on any fields. Now, the first few Mishnayos in Masechet Shavias teach us that not only is one forbidden from doing work on a field during Shemitah, however, on Erev Shavias, at the end of the 6th year, a person's also forbidden from working the lands. Now, this is not a din midrabanan, this is actually a din midoraisa. It's either learned from a pasuk or it's a halacha Moshe misinai. Now, when does that start? So the simple understanding of when that starts is 30 days before Rosh Hashanah. Why is that? Because plowing the field 30 days before Rosh Hashanah essentially can only be described as being done for the benefit of the following year. And therefore, plowing within 30 days of Rosh Hashanah of the new year is going to be asur because you are plowing for the benefit of the following year. However, Chazal did teach us that part of this halacha Moshe Misinai is that if you have young saplings that need constant work, so then you're allowed to work those trees. It's machlokas beis Shamaim and beis Hillel how long it's going to go. But what's very interesting about this is that the first Mishnah Masechah Shvias tells us that there's machlokas whether or not it goes, whether you're allowed to do it up until the trees need it, or is it up until Shavuos? And the Mishnah actually says it's basically the same amount of time. So Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are not really arguing. They're arguing on exactly what is the point in time that it has to stop. Is it when the trees don't need it anymore? Or is it a hard stopping point at Shavuos? But ultimately, it's pretty much the same time. So now, this is what we're talking about. This is what the following Mishnah talks about. And this is what it says. Ilema midatanan. If you're going to tell me that the 16 amos comes from the following place, which is Eser Netios, 10 saplings, Hamafuzaros Besof Beis Shah. So, you have 10 saplings that are spread out in a field which is a Beis Shah. A Beis Shah describes the amount of land that's necessary to produce 1 se'ah of grain. Now, how much is that? The number you have to keep in mind is 2,500 amos. Why is it? Because a base se'ah is a measurement of 50 by 50. So when you take 50 and you multiply it by 50, you get 2,500. So a base se'ah is 2,500. Now, you have 10 saplings within that base se'ah. The halacha is you're allowed to plow that entire base se'ah. Why? Because that entire base se'ah is necessary for the growth of those 10 saplings. So again, midithnan eser netios, you have 10 saplings, hamafuzaros b'soch beis se'ah, that are spread out within a base se'ah. What's the halacha? Charshin kol base se'ah b'shvilan. You're allowed to plow that entire base se'ah because of those 10 saplings, ad Rosh Hashanah, all the way up until Rosh Hashanah. So the halacha Moshe Sinai tells us that while it's true that you have to add time on in the 6th year, that you're not allowed to plow the field, if you have these 10 saplings and it's necessary for these saplings to stay alive, that you're going to work the ground for these saplings, you do not have to observe Shemitah during the 6th year. You can plow the field all the way up until Rosh Hashanah, barring maybe a few minutes, but ultimately you can go all the way up until Rosh Hashanah. Now, the Gemara says as follows: Kama havilahu, how many amos are in that field? Well, we know the math. Trey alfin, 2,000, v'chamesh mea, and 500. Sorry, garmidi, trey alfin, v'chamesh mea garmidi. You have 2,500 square amos of it. Right? That's how it works. You have 50 by 50, so you have 2,500 amos. What does that mean? That means that l'kol chad v'chad, for every one of these saplings, kama matile, how much space is given to each tree? Masan v'chamshin. You take 2,500, you divide that by 10. What do you get? You get 250 amos for each one of those trees. The problem just is, halo havi de ula. That is not the amount of space that ula gives. So now on to our paper. The very first box we have at the top is ula says that you have 16 amos to each side. So imagine, if in the top box on our paper, we plant a tree right in the center of that box. So now, you're going to have the radius on each side from that tree to the end is going to be a 16 amos. 16 plus 16 is 32. So you're going to make your box of 32 by 32, which gives us a total of 1,024 amos for each tree. Now, 1,024 amos for each tree is a lot more than 250 amos for each tree. And that's why the Gemara says that Mishnah at the beginning of Masechah Shavuos is not consistent with Ula, because that Mishnah seems to indicate that all you get for each tree is 250 amos. Okay, very simply, the entire space, the entire area where you have those 10 saplings that are growing is 2,500 amos. you're allowed to plow the entire 2,500 amos. There are 10 trees that are planted there. That means that each tree is being given 250 amos, which is dramatically less than the amount of space that Ula is giving. Therefore, the Gemara says, Halo Havi de Ula. That Mishnah is not consistent with Ula, and therefore that cannot be the place where Ula got his number of 16 amos in each direction. So the Gemara suggests another place where Ula may have learned his din from. The Elamidatran, it must be from another very similar Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in exactly the same Masechta. It's in Shavuos, just 4 Mishnayos later, and it says Midatran, Shlosha Ilanos. So in this case, which we're about to mention, we're no longer talking about saplings, small little trees. We're talking about full-grown trees. Shal Gimel B'nei Adam. You have 3 trees that belong to 3 different people. Aryeh elu mitzdarfin. You could combine them together. V'charshin kol beis sa'ah bishvilan. You could go ahead and plow the top of Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, the entire beis sa'ah, because of them. Now again, what this is talking about is, when you have an individual tree, you can't go ahead and plow for that individual tree. However, if you have a sedei ilan, if you have an orchard, then you're allowed to go ahead and plow in that orchard up until Shavuos. Now, what constitutes something as an orchard? 3 trees. The chiddush, the novelty of that Mishnah is that if the 3 trees are not owned by the same person, but owned by different people, even though their ownership is not the same, but because they're in the same area, which is within 2,500 amos, we consider them to be an orchard, and therefore between these 3 people, they're allowed to go ahead and plow that area at the end of the 6th year before Shemitah, and there's no problem. So now we have another idea over here. Now we have 3 trees that are spread out within the area of 2,500 amos. So the Gemara actually does the math for us. I think Gemara says, Kama havilahu, how much space is there? How much area is there? Trei alfi, 2,000, v'chamesh mea garmidi. You have 2,500 amos in this beis sa'ah, because the beis sa'ah never changes its size. It's always going to be a 50 by 50. Rashi actually says it a little bit differently. He basically makes this idea of having 50 strips of 50 amos each, but basically it's the same idea of 2,500 amos. Now let's go ahead and divide it. You take the 2,500 amos, you have 2,500 amos, l'kol chad v'chad kama matile. For each one of those trees, how much space are you giving it? So you divide 2,500 by 3, you're going to get tamni mea, 800, vitlasin, vitlasa, and 33, vitilsa, and a third. So that's why if you see on our page, case 2, you have 3 trees in 2,500 amos equals 833.3 for each tree. Okay? So now, we've dramatically increased the number. Our first case only allowed us 250 amos for each tree. Case 2 is 3 trees in 2,500 amos, giving us 833 amos for each tree. Why? Because 2,500 divided by 3 equals 833.3. At this point, it's still simple. Everything seems to still make sense. The problem is, akati nefishalei to Ula. Ula's amount is still more. Why? Because if you look back, all the way at the top of the page, Ula allowed 1,024 amos for each tree. In other words, he allocated, shouldn't even say he allowed, he allocated the amount of space necessary for a tree to grow is 1,024 amos. That's the area you're going to give for that tree to go ahead and pull nourishment. However, even in this case, which is quite generous, it only gave you 833 for each tree. Now, we're going to see in a second how the Gemara is going to try to answer this, but just to put this into the amount of amos, Ula said you get 16 amos for each tree. So now, if you look inside answer 1, you're going to see what's 16 plus 16 is 32. 32 times 32 is 1024. That's where we get Ula's number from. Now, where would we get the number 833 from? We got the number 833, it would have to be somewhere around 14 amos in radius for each tree. And let's just see how the Gemara answers this. The Gemara says, you know what? It's true. The reason why Ula is getting 1024 and the Mishnah is getting 833.3 is because lo duck. Ula wasn't being precise. He wasn't being so precise, and therefore the fact that he's off by a couple hundred amos is not such a big deal. Now, when you say it like that, it really sounds crazy. He's off by a couple hundred amos. Right? He's off by a couple hundred. But the truth is, he's not off by a couple hundred amos. If you look in answer 1, he's only off by an amma and a half in each direction. Why? Because what's happening here is, you're going to have, in Ula's amount, if it's 16 amos in each direction, that's how you get 32 times 32, which is 1024. But if he did 14 and a half amos in each direction, which is an amma and a half off, so then you get 29, which is going to be the diameter, because 14 and a half plus 14 and a half. So you take those two radiuses and you add them up, so you can end up with 29. So 29 times 29 gives you 841. Now you see he's not so far off, because 841 from 833 is not such a big deal. So basically he was off by about an amma and a half. That's what the Gemara says, lo duck. He wasn't being so precise. He said 16 amos, really was 14 and a half amos, not such a big deal. Now the problem the Gemara says is, mi amrinan, hold on a second, Emer damrinan lo dak l'chumra. We could say sometimes a person is not so precise when a chumra results from not being so precise. However, l'kula lo dak, when a person is going to say a kula, you have to be much more precise. Why is this true? Because what's happening, he's essentially telling you not to bring bikurim all the way up to 16 amos. So you go outside, there's a mitzvah midaraisa at the beginning of Parshas Kisava. Take the first fruits that grow on your tree and bring them up to Yerushalayim. Now, he goes outside, he measures his tree, and turns out it's 15 amos from that guy's border. Now, what would the halacha be? He should have to bring it. Right? Ula says, all the way up to 16 amos, you don't have to bring it. But hold on. If he was not being precise, then from 14 and a half and on, he has to bring it. So that amma and a half, Ula is giving you permission to skip out on your mitzvah of bikurim. So you can't be low duck that way. You can't just be a little bit flippant in the way you give your numbers and say, I wasn't paying such close attention, it's fine, now I'm going to half off, what's the difference? Well, it makes a big difference, a person's not going to go ahead and bring bikurim. So therefore the Gemara says we have to dismiss that. This can't be the place where Ula gets it from. So the Gemara says, you know what, the whole thing that's going on over here is a huge mistake. What's the mistake that's happening here? When you were measuring your 16 amos, you were measuring it as a square. But no one ever said that you're going to measure it as a square. In other words, you were taking 32 and multiplying 32, and then you're going 32 times 32, and you're making a square with all your square amos. But no one ever said that. He said you're going to make a circle around your tree, which is 16 amos in the radius the entire way around. If you look at the picture in answer number 2, you see that all that grayed out area in the box is not going to be included in this. So now we have to go ahead and figure out, how do you multiply 16 by 16 by 16 by 16, which is 32, times 32, but then go ahead and subtract the area of the square. So now no one holds me to this. I didn't pay such good attention when I was in high school, but I think that the way that you do this is, if you want to figure out the area of the circumference, you're going to have to take pi r squared, right? Because you have to take 3.14, and then you're going to multiply it by the radius 4 times. Okay? If you want to get the area of a square, you take 4r squared. Because you're taking those 4 sides, the whole 4, multiplying it by the radius 4 times. So now we're going to see that it's not exactly like that in the Gemara, but it's very, very close. So the Gemara says if you ever want to figure out the difference between the circumference of the circle and the area of the square, Gemara says the following. Gemara says, Mi savris biribua kamrinan. You thought we're talking about a square. No, the igula kamrinan. We're talking about a circle over here. Namechti. Let's take a look at this. Kama meruba yoser al ha'igul. How much more area are you going to have if you have a square versus a circle? Revia. 1 extra quarter. So now, the way we're saying it using this precise number of pi is 3.14. So it's, if you're going to multiply it, according to the Gemara, if you want to take off a quarter, you're going to multiply that number by 0.75 to get 1 quarter off. According to pi, you can multiply it by 0.84. So it's not exactly the same, but it's going to be very close. So it happens to be that we're not so concerned about this. A while ago, I gave a number of shiurim and about just learning Gemara in general. And in those shiurim, I mentioned the Mishnah in Maseches Eruvin, where the Mishnah in Maseches Eruvin gives the measurement of pi as 3. It says 3. In other words, it says, whenever you have something which the Mishnah says, Kol Amma, which is Berochav Amma, I forgot the exact terminology. If you do it in a circle, it's going to be 3. In other words, it says, if you measure the area of the diameter as 1, and you try to get the circumference, it's going to be 3. Now we know it's not 3, it's 3.14, but the Mishnah intentionally was not very precise about it. How do we know that? Because, again, you could measure it. It's not like it's a meter chiddush. In other words, that it's exactly 3.14, perhaps we had to go ahead and study that. But that it's a little bit more than 3, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure that out, because take a string and wrap it around a pipe, and then you're going to see that it's a little bit more than 3. Nevertheless, the Gemara is not always so precise in its measurement, because it's not a math book. But the idea is, it's generally pretty close. So in our Gemara, we find that over here is that whenever you have a square versus a circle, the square is going to give you 1 quarter more. So now, the Gemara says, but hold on a second. Even if you're going to subtract 1 quarter from your number, you're still going to be off by a half an amma. If you look over there next to picture by answer number 2. So again, we had our number of 1024. Where did we get 1024 from? Because we did 32 times 32. That gave us 1024. Now, if we're taking off a quarter, you multiply it by 0.75. That gives you 768. Okay? It's a difference of 256. In other words, we get a difference of 256 amos, leaving us with the number of 768. The problem is that's still off. Because how much is it off by? The Gemara says, Pashu Luhu Zayin Meya. So the Gemara does the math for us. In other words, if you can take the number of 1024, you're going to multiply it by 0.75. In other words, taking away 1 quarter. Pashu Luhu, what's left? Zayin Meya, 700, Vishitin Utmanya. Exactly the number that we get on our own calculators, which is 768. The Gemara says, Akati Pashlu Pagad Amsa. You're still left over with a half of an amma. Now this is where the math becomes problematic. Because if you look at the bottom of the page, let's try to work this out. Okay? The Gemara is trying to say that Ula's number of 16 amos was off by a half an amma. In other words, if you did 16.5, then you'd get to that number of 768. But if you look, we do the math in the bottom, 16.5 times 16.5 gives us 33. 33 times 33 is going to give us 1089. 1089 multiplied by 0.75 to get a quarter off is going to give us 816. 816 is not consistent with the number of 830, not consistent with the number we're looking for. We're looking for 833. Remember, our number we got at the beginning, if you look all the way back, by case 2, the Mishnah in Maseches Shavios gave us 3 trees and 2,500 amos. So you take 2,500 amos, divide it by 3 trees, that gives you 833.3 for each tree. What we're ending up with over here is 816 for each tree. That's still off. It's still not the right number. And that's why we have to get to the next line, which is essentially what Tosfos tells us, which is even the Gemara, when it said it's off by a half amma, was not being precise. So interestingly, the Gemara was saying Ula wasn't being precise, and in the Gemara's description of Ula not being precise, the Gemara itself wasn't either precise. Because really what it is he was off by 2/3 of an amma. So it should have been 16 and 2/3 of an amma. That's why I went ahead and worked hard to get this calculation. So look at this at the bottom. If you go 33.333 instead of 33, and you multiply that by 33.333, you get 1,111.8. Now take that number of 1,111.8, multiply that by 75 to take off a quarter, and guess what number you get? 833.3. There we go. Perfect. So you look at that number that's highlighted in the bottom of the page, you have 33.3 times 2, divided by 2, it's 16.66. In other words, if you take the diameter of 33.333, cut it in half, so you have the radius of half that number, you get 16.666. Okay? So now, when the Gemara said that Ula was off by a half amma, we now see in our calculation he was off by a drop more than a half an amma. In other words, the Gemara says he was off by 0.5. In our calculation, he was off by 0.6. Make sense? Good? Now, so that's why the Gemara now is still stuck with Ula and says, Ula, you're still off by 0.6. You told us that it goes only 16 amos. But according to our calculation that we just made over here, it should be 16.6. And now the Gemara says that I can answer simply. Why? So again, let's read this inside. Kama meruba yoser al eagle. How much more is in it? How much more is a square than a circle? Revia, a quarter. Pashu lahu zayin meya b'shifim t'manya. But the Gemara says, "Kati pashu palgid yamsa." You're still stuck with a half amma. The way we're describing it, it's 0.6 of an amma. The Gemara says, "Hainu de lo dak." That's what he means when he says lo dak l'churma lo dak. In other words, Ula himself wasn't being precise. He moved it back by 16 amos and telling you that if you have a tree whose roots extend 16 amos and it goes into your next door neighbor's field, no bikurim. But he was low duck, he wasn't precise in his measurement because he should have said 16.6. However, he was low duck with a little bit of astringency, and therefore if you're going to have a tree which is 16 amos but not 16.6 amos, then you're going to go ahead and bring the bikurim, even though technically you should not bring the bikurim for another half an amma. Okay? Makes sense? So now Ula's halacha of 16 amos is perfectly consistent with the Mishnah in the Maseches Shavios. Both the Mishnah in the Maseches Shavios and Ula come up with that calculation that the amount of space that each tree needs is a circle of 833.3 amos, which is 16.6 in each direction. Good? You can put the papers away. We'll move on now with the rest of the Gemara. Tashema. Let's just see if he's right. Hakona ilan v'karko. Person buys a tree and the surrounding karka. Halacha is maybe vikore. He has to bring bikurim and he has to read the entire parsha of bikurim. Now, my love, when it says the person buys a tree and the karka, the ground around it, kol shehu, that he buys any amount of karka, he doesn't have to buy all 16 amos, which is not consistent with the halacha of Ula. The Gemara says no, lo yud vav amma. What it means is he buys the tree and 16 amos in all directions. And again, every time we're going to say 16 amos in all directions, what we mean to say is 16.6. Okay, Tashema. Let's bring another ayah to see if he's correct. Kanash ne'elanos, the person bought 2 trees, b'sof shel chavero, in his friend's property. Maybe ve'eno kore, he brings bikurim, but he does not have to read the parsha. Hashlosha. What happens if he would have bought 3 trees? Maybe v'kore, he'd have to go ahead and bring bikurim and read the parsha. Now hold on. What did he buy when he bought these trees? My love, let's assume kol shehu, that he bought these trees and a tiny bit of karka. Gemara says no. He bought actually achanami yuvav amma. He bought 16 amos of land around those trees. Again, not a problem for Ula. Tashema, another attempted raya to this halacha. Mekiva says, karka kol shehu, if you take a little bit of karka, the halach is chayiv bepeya. You have to, when you're going to harvest that tiny piece of karka, you have to leave the corner over for the aniyim, for the poor people. Ube bikurim, and you have to bring bikurim from the fruits that grow in that small piece of karka. The coast from the love prosbol, and you could write a prosbol on it. Now, prosbol is not our topic for today. However, it's brought here in the Gemara, and Rashi invests a tremendous amount of time talking about it. Therefore, we will. What's a prosbol? A prosbol is another halacha with regard to shvius. The halacha is at the end of Shemitah, all personal loans are canceled. The pasuk tells us that a person has to be very careful not to withhold loans from your friend because you're scared that Shemitah will go ahead and cancel it. The problem was people were scared. The people were not giving out their money. People weren't lending out money because they said, I'm going to lend someone money, Shemitah is going to come and it's going to cancel the loan, and therefore I'm not bothering to lend someone money. Therefore, Hillel instituted a takana called prosbol. We did this just a couple of years ago here in Shul at the end of Shemitah, which is that you write a document, you transfer all your loans to the Beis Din, and loans that are owned by a Beis Din are not canceled, and therefore people found a way to get around having their loans canceled. One of the things that is required is that the lova has to actually own, the person who borrowed money has to own a piece of property. How much property? Says our Gemara, kol shehu, a tiny little piece. Top of Chaf Zayin Amud Beis. Another halacha about a very small piece of karka. You're allowed to be, you can use that tiny piece of property to be konat nechasim she'ein lahem achrayus with it. This is the kinyan of agav. What this means is whenever you buy real property, all movable objects that are left in that property can be acquired by simply acquiring the property. So, if you buy a piece of property and there's lawn furniture there, and the person who's selling it to you wants you to be able to own that lawn furniture, you don't have to go ahead and pick up each one of those things. Simply buying the property, the real property, includes the purchase of the movable objects as well. How much property is necessary for this to be accomplished? Kol shehu, a small little piece. Now again, what do you see? That if you own kol shehu, a tiny piece of karka, you have to bring bikurim. But hold on, Ula told us you have to own 16 amos in each direction. This is not talking about trees. Ula, when he said you have to have 16 amos, that was referring to a tree that has a lot of roots. However, we're not talking about trees, we're talking about grain. Grain is very small, doesn't have that many roots. Dekonami, it seems like that's the case. The katani kol shehu, it says kol shehu, Shamaim, what are you going to plant in kol shehu? You can't plant a tree on a tiny piece of property. You can plant one stalk of grain. Shemaim, okay. Tashma, another raya. Elon, you have a tree, miktaso be'eretz, miktaso b'chutz. You have a tree which is partially growing in Eretz Yisrael and partially growing in Chutz La'aretz. Says the first opinion, tevel v'chulin mu'uravin zebazeh. You have a tree that's partially carrying tevel and partially carrying chulin. In other words, produce that grows in Eretz Yisrael are obligated to give truma. You must give truma. You have to take off different tithings from that produce. If it grows in Chutz La'aretz, you do not have to take off those tithings. Now this tree is a hybrid. It has part of it growing in Eretz Yisrael, part of it growing in Chutz La'aretz. The first opinion, which is Rabbi, he says, Teva v'chulin mu'uravin zabazeh. You have a tree that's carrying partially chulin and partially tevel, and therefore you have to figure out which part is growing in Eretz Yisrael, which part is growing in Chutz La'aretz, and what's growing in Chutz La'aretz, no truma. What's growing in Eretz Yisrael, yes truma. Reb Shlomo disagrees. He says, "Hagad l'v'chiv," the part that's going in Eretz Yisrael, chayiv. Hagad l'v'pater, pater. I'm sorry. So according to Rebbe, everything is mixed together, and you can't really figure it out. According to Reb Shlomo, you just divide which part is going in Eretz Yisrael, which part is going in Chutz La'aretz. Now, ad kan lo pligi, the entire machlokus between Rebbe and Reb Shlomo is el damar savra yesh breira, amar savra ein breira. This is just the difference between whether or not you can figure out which trees are growing in Eretz Yisrael, and which ones are growing in Chutz La'aretz. Now, we've mentioned breira many times throughout Shas. Breira generally means retroactive clarification. In other words, you don't know something now, but later you figure it out. This is not that type of breira. because there's nothing retroactive over here. It's nothing you're finding out later. What this just means is that what you're doing is you're determining which fruits from this tree are growing in Eretz Yisrael and which ones are growing in Chutz La'aretz. Now that's the machlokes between Rabbi and Shimon Gamliel. Can you do that or can you not do that? Avol gadol bipitor, if you know something grew in a place of pitor, in other words, Chutz La'aretz, to be called pater. Everyone agrees that it's pater. Now hold on a second. You told me, Ula, that when a tree grows, its roots go out 16 amos. So no, what do I care if my tree is partially growing in Chutz La'aretz? Its roots are going to Eretz Yisrael, and therefore I certainly should have to go ahead and take off truma from the whole tree. Gemara says, this is talking about a case where it's like a really strange case. You have this massive stone growing in the middle of the tree, right on the border of Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, the roots of Chutz La'aretz are stuck in Chutz La'aretz. The roots of Eretz Yisrael are stuck in Eretz Yisrael. Gemara says, hold on. If that's the case, my time with the Rebbe. Why is Rabbi saying that everything's mixed together? It's not mixed together. The roots are divided by this massive stone. Gemara says the Hadar Arvi. He's of the opinion that it goes ahead and gets mixed later on in the trunk. In other words, it's true that the roots are growing in different places, but you can't forget about the fact that they come together, they all coalesce inside the trunk. Gemara says, okay. What are they arguing about? Mar Savar Avira Mevalbel. The first opinion, which is Rabbi says, the yireh in the avir, in other words, the exposed part of the tree actually mixes it together. Each one has its own status in its own place. Okay, so we don't have any problem from there. Now, the Gemara says, hold on, are you telling me that a tree's roots only go out 16 amos? That's not true. For Tanan, we have a mission that says, you have to distance your tree from another person's bar. How much space? We just learned this on Shabbos. 25 amos. So why are you telling me it only goes 16 amos? You're off by 9 amos. The Gemara says it's true. You have to move your tree away from someone else's bar 25 amos. That's because Mazel, Amar Abaya, Mazel Tuva Azli. The roots do go farther than 16 amos. However, akushi lo makhishi, they do not make the ground weak. Ella ad sheish esrei amma. Tfei lo makhishi. How much area do the roots actually suck the nutrients out of the land? That's only for the first 16 amos. However, the roots will grow farther than 16 amos, and that growth can damage your next door neighbor's pit in his backyard. But that's not considered stealing your next door neighbor's property, because those parts of the roots are not actually sustaining the tree. Okay, Kiyas Rav Dimi, Amar, Ba Minei Rish Lakish Mi Rebbe. When Rav Dimi came, he reported that Rish Lakish asked Rav Yochanan, so Ba Minei Rish Lakish Mi Rabbi Yochanan, Ilan Asamach Lametz V'Sel Yudav Vav Amma. If you have a tree, exactly Ula's case, you have a tree that's growing by the border of someone else's field, within 16 amos. Mahu, what's the halach? Amrle Gazlanu, he's a thief because his tree is being sustained by using his next door neighbor's property. The ain mevian mimenu bikurim, he cannot bring bikurim because it's not his. Kiyasa Ravin, however, when Ravin came, he said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Echad Ilan. Samach Lametzar, the Echad Ilan, Hanota, whether this tree is close to the person's border or it's leaning into the person's border, maybe bikore, he does bring bikurim, he does recite the entire parsha. Why shall manaskin hinchel Yeshua li Yisrael as aretz? When Yeshua divided the land, he made certain conditions, and one of the conditions was that if a person has a tree growing, you can't be makbid. In other words, people have to be a little bit forgiving, allow people to allow their roots from the next door neighbor to go into your backyard. Don't get all hung up on the fact that your next door neighbor's roots are coming into your backyard. It's okay. Okay, next Mishnah, Elon, Shahu, Nota, L'Sdei Chavera. You have a tree that's leaning into your next door neighbor's field. Halach is Kotzeis Melo Hamardeya. Your next door neighbor has the right to ask you to cut down the amount of space that he needs to ride on an animal and to hold the whip in his hand to control the animal. Al Gabe Mecharesh, on top of the place where he's plowing. Ubecharav ubeshikma, if he has charav or shikma trees, the halach is Kneged HaMeshkolos you make a straight line up, like a plumb line straight up, and you cut off all those trees. In other words, if it's just a regular tree, you just cut off the area that you need to be able to pass. But these trees have a lot of branches, you can make a straight line up and cut it all down. Beis HaShlachim, if you're in a field which requires irrigation because it doesn't have enough rainwater, then, I don't know why, but it seems like shade is very bad for those trees. Kol ilan keneged hamishkolos. You could cut down any tree, not only charav and shikma. You make a line straight up. You cut off any branches that are there. Abashal says kol ilan srak keneged hamishkolos. Any barren tree within that area can be cut down. The Gemara asks immediately, Ibailu Abashal Aryeh Shakai Ayasefak. When Abashal told us that any tree, that barren trees are going to be included, was he going ahead and he was adding that into the Reisha, which is the first case which said that you can cut it down. Keneged hamishkolos, if it's charav or shikma, was he adding on a barren tree, or was he limiting the second case of the Mishnah, or was he going to the second case of the Mishnah by a field that requires irrigation? Gemara says, Tashma, bring a raya. The Tanya, it says clearly, Beis HaShlach, and if you have a field that requires irrigation, Abashal says, Kol ilan keneged hamishkolos, every tree is cut one straight line up. Why? B'pnei shatzel ra lebeis HaShlachim, because shade is bad for these types of fields. Shema mina Aryeh Shakai. It must be, he was talking about the first case, and you're just saying in the first case that even a barren tree can go, you cut it straight up, not only those trees that are listed there. Shema mina. Rabashi, our Mishnah actually seems to indicate this as well. The Ketani Kol Ilan Srak. It adds in the word Kol. If you want to tell me that this is talking about only, it's including the first case, Hana the Ketani Kol. That's why it says Kol, because he's adding in even barren trees. Aliya Tasef. If you're telling me it's coming only for the last part of the Mishnah, Aseifa Kai Ilan Srak mi Baile. It should simply say Ila. In other words, if he's limiting it, then it should say Ila, not Kol. Allah, Shmamina, Aryeh Shakai, must be talking about the first case, Shmamina. Okay, next Mishnah. Ilan Shunot Rishus Rabbim. You have a tree that is growing over into Rishus Rabbim. So the previous Mishnah talked about when a tree is growing into your next neighbor's backyard. Here it's a tree that's going into the public domain. So people can't pass by because the tree is blocking their path. Halach is Kotzeitz, Kadei Shehe Gamal Over Verochvo. Like this, a camel can pass by, and a person riding it will be able to pass by as well. Yehuda says that's not how we measure it. Rather, gamal ton pishton or chavili zemoros. You have to make enough space for a camel carrying either pishton, flax, or bundles of wood. Rabbi Shimon Omer kol ha'ilan keneged hamishkolos ne'atuma. Any tree that is leaning over into Rishus Rabbim, you make a straight line up, you take a laser, you point it up, you cut off all those branches that go into Rishus Rabbim. Why? Because of Tumah. We'll explain this in the Gemara. Now, man tana de benizaken bas unduno tehashta azlina. Who is the one who says that when potential damage is happening, we assess the damage based off of now, we don't take into consideration that something might happen later. In other words, in this case, we're saying cut just the branches down. But hold on, the branches are going to grow back. Maybe you have to cut down the whole tree. Our Mishnah says we don't worry about later, just worry about now. Cut the branches, don't cut the whole tree down. Gemara says, this is dependent on a machlokes, a dispute in another place. Why? For Rabbi Eliezer, he is Rabbi Eliezer. Now, for we learned in the Mishnah, Ein osen chalal tachas Rishus Rabbim. You can't dig a tunnel under Rishus Rabbim, baros shichnim aros, or these little pits under Rishus Rabbim. Even if you cover these pits up, you cannot dig it under a public domain. Rabbi Eliezer says it's okay, as long as the cover is strong enough that it could sustain a chariot or a wagon that's holding stones. In other words, what are they worried about? The first opinion says we're worried you can't dig this hole under Rishus Rabbim because even if you cover it, maybe you'll fall through the cover. So in other words, the Chachamim are not necessarily satisfied with the fact that today it's covered. Rabbi Eliezer says today it's covered, it's fine. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Filoteim Rabbanan, we could say our Mishnah is even consistent with the Rabbanan because Hasam Zimnin Demafchis V'Labadaite. Every single day that cover gets worn away, and one day someone might just fall right through it and fall into the bark. Abul Hacha Kama Kokaitzle. You could actually watch the branches growing out. So it's not going to be a surprise that the branches one day, as you're walking by, boom, all the branches came out and knocked you in the head. They grow slowly, you can cut them down as they grow. Yehuda says, Gamal Tan Pishtan, O Chavilis Himaros. So again, we had a dispute how much space you have to have, either enough space for a camel rider to pass through, or a camel filled with its load. Which one of these is bigger? The Gemara says, of course, the opinion of the Rabbanan is more. Why do you talk that if you'll think the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda is more? Now hold on. The Rabbanan b'shiyud Rabbi Yehuda hechi avdi. According to Rabbanan, how are you going to pass through if you're on a camel? If you're only using the amount of space Yehuda gives, so obviously they must have given more space. Gemara says, hold on. Same argument can be made the other way around. If you tell me that the opinion of the Rabbanan is that they gave more space, Yehuda b'shiyud Rabbanan my avid. What's Yehuda going to do if you pass with that amount of space? How are you going to go ahead? How are you going to pass by if you're on the camel? How are you going to get by if it's not enough space? Gemara says that's not a problem. Since you're a person, you can go ahead and bow down, make some more space. But you can't ask the load of wood. Could you just bow down for a minute because it's not able to move? Last few lines. Every tree that's over Rosh Hashanah, you have to go ahead and cut it. Why? Because of Tumah. Gemara says Tana mipnei Oel Tumah. We're worried about Oel, which means anytime you have something which is covering Tumah, anything under that covering is going to become Tameh. So now if you have a tree, and inside this guy's backyard you have something Tameh, and the tree is being Ma'ahil, it's going over the Rosh Hashanah, and anybody passes by comes Tameh, that's why you have to cut it down. More says Pshita, of course. It says we're worried about Tumah. Gemara says no. Even must listen if just because of the language of our Mishnah, I would think what we're worried about is maybe a bird, a raven will come ahead and drop some tumah down on top of the tree, and then the actual tumah might be on top of your head. And then besagi b'dechuli bi'ama, I would say it's enough just to simply thin out those trees. It's like this, it won't be able to hold any tumah there. Kamash Malan, our Mishnah teaches us that even if it's very thin, it's not going to be enough. Why? Because it's still going to be a problem of Tumah. Just for your knowledge, Tosha disagrees on this analysis and says it's not that we're going to say that the chule means that it's thinning out the trees. What it means is maybe you would think to put a scarecrow, that would be enough to scare away the ravens. Kamash Malan, Hadron Allah Lo Yachbar. I look forward to starting Perek Cheskas Sabatim with you tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.